Imagine sitting in a dimly lit, quiet room. Across from you sits a master physician. He does not ask about your sins, and he does not promise you a mystical heaven. He simply looks at you, observes the heavy, exhausted slump of your shoulders, and says, "You are in pain, and you have been in pain for a very long time." Even on a good day, when you are fed, clothed, and safe, there is often a quiet, underlying hum of anxiety. You feel it as the creeping dread on a Sunday evening, the hollow emptiness of scrolling through a phone in the dark, or the belief that you will only truly be happy after the next milestone. This background radiation of the mind represents a universal baseline of the human condition. For over 2 millennia, the Western world has mistranslated the Buddha's first noble truth into the English phrase, "life is suffering." This translation has falsely branded Buddhism as a pessimistic philosophy, suggesting that life is nothing but agony. Siddhartha Gautama was a clinical realist. The specific term he used to describe the human condition was dukkha. Dukkha describes a state of unsatisfactoriness. It is the mechanical friction of a wheel grinding slightly off its axle, squeaking with every rotation. If our baseline state is mechanical friction, we must identify the forces causing the human mind to constantly grind against reality. The first governing law of the universe is anicca, or impermanence. Absolutely everything is in a state of flux. Mountains erode, stars collapse, and cells die. The universe is a massive, roaring river. Inside your skull, the invisible architect operates on a different set of rules. Your brain evolved for biological survival. Survival requires predictability. To keep an organism alive, the brain demands total control over its environment. This survival instinct mutates into the human ego's obsession with permanence. We demand that youth last forever and loved ones never leave, attempting to build rigid dams in the middle of a fluid river. The physics of constant change collide directly with the biological mandates of a brain seeking static control. Dukkha is the psychological friction generated when the rigid, inflexible ego rubs against the ever-changing reality of the universe. This grinding produces the earthquakes of our anxiety, our grief, and our anger. When we refuse to accept this friction, we become trapped in samsara, the illusion. We treat every loss or aging process as a personal attack by the universe. Our exhaustion stems from the constant, futile resistance against the gravity of time. Why is the recognition of this friction considered a noble truth? When a doctor diagnoses you, you do not get angry at the doctor. You feel a sense of clarity. You finally have a name for the pain you have been carrying. Because the ego demands the appearance of total control, we often feel forced to hide the friction of our lives. Accepting dukkha provides the psychological permission to drop the exhausting performance of toxic positivity. You do not have to smile through the grinding of the wheel. The first truth validates your exhaustion. While the friction of being a human being is real, it is a shared, universal weight. You are not uniquely cursed. Healing can finally begin the moment we stop demanding the universe freeze in place and accept the diagnosis of dukkha.
There is a quiet, background radiation of anxiety and dissatisfaction that grinds away at the human condition. The ancients called this dukkha, the first noble truth. To understand it, we first have to admit a structural reality about ourselves. The psychological baseline of the human mind is inherently off balance. But a diagnosis is only half the battle. A physician who tells you that you are sick and leaves the room hasn't actually helped you. To cure the sickness, you have to identify the mechanism causing it. We need to execute a clinical autopsy of the mind to isolate the invisible architecture generating this chronic friction. Over 2 millennia ago, the Buddha isolated this exact pathogen with surgical precision. He defined it in the second noble truth as a virus called Tanha. Achieving true psychological freedom means we have to stop projecting blame onto the external world and instead begin dissecting our own internal machinery. If you read modern texts, you will usually see Tanha translated into English as craving or desire. But these gentle translations fail. They miss the biological desperation driving the concept. As seen in this typographic breakdown,
The ancient Pali word Tanha does not mean a casual want. Its literal clinical definition is thirst. Picture a traveler lost in a vast, scorched desert. His throat is parched, and his entire existence narrows down to a single frantic obsession: water. He is not casually wishing for a drink. He is driven by a primitive, unhinged necessity, willing to destroy anything and crawl through glass just to get a single drop. This desert is the untamed daily operation of the human mind. We walk through life perpetually dehydrated, constantly searching for the next external oasis, a new status, a relationship, a financial milestone, to pour into our internal void. This schematic illustrates the fatal structural flaw of the human mind's architecture. As external milestones are poured in, the baseline continually dissolves into negative space. The vessel is completely bottomless. Attempting to cure an internal psychological void with external achievements is therefore a mathematical impossibility. To locate the physical engine of this thirst, we have to bridge the gap between ancient philosophy and modern evolutionary psychology. The brutal truth of our biology is that the brain was engineered strictly for survival and reproduction. Evolution does not care about your inner peace. The specific neurochemical driving this survival imperative is dopamine. There is a widespread professional misconception that dopamine is the chemical of pleasure and reward. It is not. Dopamine is pure anticipation, peaking sharply as a target is approached. Here, the brain promises this goal will permanently halt your anxiety, but upon reaching it, satisfaction evaporates, crashing below the baseline. Instantly, the mind resets the goalposts, locking you onto the hedonic treadmill. As long as we operate blindly on this dopamine loop, we are trapped in the endless, unresolvable striving known as samsara. This diagram illustrates how the underlying biological fractures into three specific structural behaviors within the mind. The first mechanism is kama tanha, the endless hunt for sensory pleasure and dopamine spikes. It enslaves us to our comfort zones, generating a constant terror of any physical or emotional friction. The second mechanism is bhava tanha, the ego's existential thirst for becoming and status. Here, we tie our absolute self-worth to temporary titles, driven by a desperate need for external validation from the world. The third mechanism is vibhava tanha, the darker craving for non-becoming and the urge to destroy. This manifests as addiction, avoidance, and the strict refusal to face the shadow elements of reality. Whether a person is chasing luxury, defending a job title, or numbing their pain, they are utterly controlled by the exact same underlying biological architecture. The second noble truth acts as a brutal mirror, forcing a direct confrontation with the self. The ego's primary defense mechanism is to project malicious intent onto the external world to avoid inward analysis. We prefer to blame a partner, the economy, or our past. But external tragedies, losses, and insults are simply neutral events occurring in a fluid universe. The external world does not have the power to make you suffer. The suffering only begins when your tanha attaches to it. The origin point is born exclusively in the gap between what reality is and what your craving demands reality to be. Think of navigating the events of reality like interacting with water. This turbulence is what happens when you violently, frantically attempt to grasp the uncontrollable. The illusion is believing you are drowning because the water is inherently hostile. As the water settles, the truth is you are drowning purely because you are trying to grab the water and hold it entirely still. Realizing that the invisible architect of your misery is your own mind is a terrifying realization, yet it is the first necessary step toward absolute psychological autonomy. Because the virus of suffering is generated entirely within your own biological machinery, the absolute power to cure it rests entirely within your own hands. In a clinical, shadowed room, a physician explains the severity of a diagnosis and the aggressive nature of a virus. There is a breathless pause. You look up and ask the only question that matters: is there a cure? This medical tension mirrors the human condition. We all feel the heavy friction of dukkha, suffering, And we are all driven by the virus of Tanha, the unquenchable thirst of the ego. We operate as if infected by a terminal psychological disease, spending our lives searching for an external fix for a pain that is being generated from within. Our instinct is to solve this through addition. We believe by acquiring more strength, better circumstances, or a promised afterlife, the pain will finally stop. It is like holding a heavy, jagged stone at arm's length for decades. Your muscles are screaming and your joints are tearing, yet you spend your life praying for the stone to become lighter or for your arms to grow stronger. The third noble truth, Nirodha, offers a different path. It translates to cessation or release. You don't need to get stronger to bear the weight. You just open your hand and drop the stone. Because this suffering is generated by the invisible architect of your own mind, the cure is entirely internal. You don't need a savior or a change in circumstances. You need a psychological surrender. Western culture had repackaged the result of this surrender as a luxury. We see nirvana used to sell energy drinks and spa retreats, framing it as a mystical heaven where nothing bad ever happens. But the ancient Pali word nirvan has a much more grounded meaning. It translates to blowing out, like extinguishing the flame of a candle. You are extinguishing the three fires of the primitive brain: the fire of craving, the fire of hatred, and the fire of delusion. When you blow out a candle, the flame doesn't go to a better place. It simply ceases to exist. Nirvana is the end of the ego's frantic, burning resistance to reality. It is the moment the internal war stops. The ego is terrified of this. It tells you that if you stop running on the dopamine treadmill, you will become a hollow, apathetic shell. In Buddhist psychology, this state is called sunyata. While it translates to emptiness, it is not a dark or terrifying void. Think of it as the clearing of a crowded floor. By removing the clutter, you create the necessary space for focus and clarity to grow. Consider the mental energy you currently spend managing your status and soothing your fears. When you stop draining your resources on the ego's defense, that energy remains available for your actual life. Without the need to validate yourself through others, you can love people for who they are. You can engage in your work as a pure expression of craft, rather than a desperate attempt to gain status. Abandoning the thirst for validation doesn't empty your life of meaning. It is the prerequisite for experiencing the world as it actually is. Nirodha brings us to a final paradox. Extinguishing the fire of the ego does not stop the pain of human existence. The world remains unchanged. You will still face physical illness, the aging of the body, and the loss of loved ones. To understand why this is a cure, we have to distinguish between pain and suffering. Here we see a single impact event, the pain, but it is followed by a compounding wave of erratic secondary spikes. This secondary wave is suffering. It is the ego screaming in resistance, asking, "Why me?" and multiplying the initial injury by 1,000. When the ego's narrative is removed, the pain is just pain. It is clean. It is a manageable biological response. You sit in a mental sanctum and allow the pain to wash through you like a passing storm. You don't fight the weather. You remain unshakable while it passes. By systematically subtracting the ego's resistance, you find that the flame is out. You have not changed the world. You have changed your capacity to be free within it. Imagine a patient who has lived with a shattered leg for years. A surgeon finally aligns the bone, and the agonizing pressure is released, but the recovery is only beginning. Because the limb has been immobile for so long, the muscle has wasted away. If this patient walks out of the ward today, the bone will snap again under the weight of a single step. They require months of repetitive daily physical therapy to rebuild the structural integrity of the leg. This is the state of the modern mind. We might understand why we suffer, but the mental muscle required to stay upright is weak. We remain prone to the same collapses and the same cognitive fog because our internal architecture has atrophied through years of reactive habit. The fourth noble truth, Magga, or the path, is the physical therapy for this condition. It is a clinical regimen designed to strengthen the mind's resilience until it can support the weight of reality without breaking. This regimen is encoded in the Dharma wheel. It is an engine of 8 interconnected parts, rather than a linear list of chores. These spokes are organized into 3 specific functional pillars: wisdom, ethics, and mental discipline. The system requires total synchronization. If you focus on your thoughts but ignore your actions, the imbalance stops the rotation of the entire hub. Breaking the cycle of modern anxiety requires this interdependent approach. To move forward, we have to build a mind where every habit supports the others. The rehabilitation begins by addressing how the brain interprets incoming data. This is the pillar of wisdom, which functions as a recalibration of the invisible architect that shapes your world. Step 1 is right view, the biological acceptance of impermanence. It is the shift from seeing yourself as a static, isolated object in a hostile world to recognizing that you are a temporary process, like a wave moving through an ocean, inseparable from the water around it. Once the lens is clear, you apply right intention. You make a deliberate, functional commitment to stop fueling the impulses of craving and hostility. You are essentially deciding to stop feeding those mental habits that keep you stuck on the dopamine treadmill. By reframing how you see yourself and your desires, the mental fog begins to thin. You've created the stable foundation necessary to begin working on the nervous system itself. The second pillar, sila, covers your speech, actions, and livelihood. While these are often called ethics, the Buddha's application was clinical rather than moralistic. These guidelines serve as a mechanism for friction reduction. They are designed to lower the baseline noise of your internal environment. When you lie, steal, or cause harm, your amygdala remains on high alert, constantly scanning for threats. A brain flooded with adrenaline and guilt is locked out of deep focus. You cannot perform psychological surgery while your survival brain screams. Ethical living is simply the pragmatic tool used to quiet the survival response. By removing the friction of conflict, you allow the nervous system to settle into a state where deeper work is possible. Only when the lens is clear and the nervous system is calm can you use the final tools of the path, samadhi or mental discipline. This is where the actual reconstruction of the self takes place. Right effort is the first tool, the active habit of weeding the mind. You learn to recognize ruminating thoughts like anger or jealousy the moment they sprout, cutting them off before they can take root in your behavior. Right mindfulness follows, establishing a state of non-judgmental observation. You begin to see your emotions as passing weather, clouds moving across the sky. You are the vast, unchanging space that contains them. Finally, through right concentration, the mind becomes as precise as a laser. In this state, the sense of a separate observer looking at the world begins to fade. The mental boundaries you've spent a lifetime building start to dissolve. This final stage of discipline strips away the last reactive layers of the ego. You are no longer a victim of your impulses. You are the steady witness of them. When all 8 spokes turn together, the result is a state of sustained clarity. The fog of constant reaction and the pull of the dopamine treadmill lose their power over you. This is the relief of nirvana. It is the end of the exhausting struggle to force the universe to match your specific desires. You have finally stopped fighting the tide. The reward of this grueling rehabilitation is a mind that is no longer easily shaken. By rebuilding your internal architecture, you gain the ability to face tragedy and change without being destroyed by them. You have at last become the master of your own perspective.